Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to look at Simple Notification Service or SNS. So what is SNS? I'm sure most of you know what it is by now. We did look at it when we set up a billing alert for our AWS environment. But basically, SNS is Simple Notification Service, and it's a web service that makes it easy to set up, operate, and send notifications from the cloud. And it provides developers with a highly scalable, flexible, and cost-effective capability to publish messages from an application and immediately deliver them to subscribers or to other applications. So SNS allows you to do push notifications. You can do these to Apple, to Google, to Fire OS, and to Windows devices, as well as Android devices in China with Baidu Cloud Push. So it allows you to do push notifications to your mobile devices. And besides pushing cloud notifications directly to mobile devices, SNS can also deliver notifications by SMS text messages or by email to Amazon SQS or to any HTTP endpoint. So it's a way of pushing out information both to mobile devices as well as text messages, as well as to SQS or to any HTTP endpoint. And it basically allows you to group multiple recipients using topics. And a topic is basically an access point, or just think of it as like what you would think a topic would be, for allowing recipients to dynamically subscribe for identical copies of the same notification. So when you set a billing alert, for example, that's a billing topic. You might have a auto-scaling alert, which is a separate topic. And basically you have subscribers within those topics. So one topic can support deliveries to multiple endpoint types. For example, you can group together iOS, Android, and SMS recipients. And when you publish once to a topic, SNS delivers appropriately formatted copies of your message to each subscriber. And then to prevent messages from being lost, all messages published to SNS are stored redundantly across multiple availability zones. So you don't have to worry about SNS's availability. It is stored redundantly across multiple AZs. And that's really it. You just need to understand what SNS is and the benefits. So in terms of my exam tips, what are the benefits for SNS? Well, it gives you instantaneous push-based delivery. So there's no polling. This is push. It gives you a simple API and easy integration with applications. You get flexible message delivery over multiple transport protocols. It's inexpensive. It's pay-as-you-go model with no upfront costs. And its web-based AWS Management Console offers the simplicity of point-and-click interface. So you can go into the Management Console and just configure your SNS notifications. It's super simple. We're going to see that in the next section of the course. And then finally, really what you need to understand is SNS versus SQS. And you'll find this as a common theme amongst your different application services. Amazon like to quiz you on the differences between SWF and SQS, and then SNS and SQS. So both SNS and SQS are both messaging systems in AWS, but SNS is push. You push the messages out to your different devices via text message or via notifications, etc. Whereas SQS is pull-based. You have to have EC2 instances sitting there polling the SQS queue. So again, if you've got a scenario-based question where they're asking you if it should be pushed out to individual users via a notification or via a text message, then think SNS. Or via email, think SNS. But if you've got a scenario-based question where you need EC2 instances to poll information, then that's going to be SQS. And that is literally it. Understand the difference between SNS and SQS, as well as what SNS is. So that is it for this lecture, everyone. In the next lecture, we're going to look at Elastic Transcoder. And again, you just basically need to understand what it is. I'm then going to go on to API Gateway and then Kinesis. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.